Chair Raskin, I know we already tested you, so I apologize, but if you could tilt the camera up just a little bit further, because it looks like.
Dean Brown-Nagin.
Yes.
Are you teaching First Amendment this past year or this coming semester?
I am not. While I'm deaning, I have a dispensation from teaching. So not doing that now. My teaching at the moment is limited to freshman seminars, which is a great thing to do. Students are very
Gotcha. Well, I used to teach First Amendment back in the day, and I miss it very much.
Do you? I bet. It's such an important area of law, and the students are all very interested in it.
Yeah. Well, it would be a very lively time to be teaching First Amendment.
Yes, and constitutional law generally. Thank you for this briefing. It's so important.
Well, I appreciate your joining us.
Sure thing.
Mr. Raskin, it looks like your video is now off. Are you able to turn it back on?
There we go. I've got to step out of the room for 1 second.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll mute you.
I want to remind the members of a few procedural points and then the subject matter focus of the briefing. The briefing is being live streamed. For this reason, members will be asked to turn on their video when they are recognized for questions. Staff should keep their videos off at all times. Members should remain muted to minimize background noise and feedback until they're recognized by the chair for questions and are unmuted by our host. Members who want to question briefers should inform committee staff that they would like to do so. They can do this in two ways. One, by using the chat function, or two, by having their staff contact the majority staff by email chain that has been established. Members will be recognized in normal seniority order for 5 minutes of questioning each. We have a timer that should be visible to you on your screen when you are in the grid view under the username 0-timer. Members who experience any technical difficulty should notify committee staff as soon as possible using the chat box located under the participants panel or by email. This briefing today will feature 3 different video clips. Due to the technical limitations of WebEx, we're not going to be able to play the videos for WebEx participants. We will instead show you still images captured from the videos while the videos are played over the live stream for the public. And I want to thank the staff for making this possible and putting it all together. Links to each of the videos have previously been shared with your staff as well as with each member. If you did not watch them before the briefing, I do encourage you to do so when the briefing is over. The images you see and the sound you hear will be shocking indeed and underscore the importance of the witness testimony today. We will begin the briefing in just a moment when committee staff tells me that they're ready to go ahead and begin the live stream. I want to thank all the members for being here too. Okay. The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties briefing on the First Amendment under attack, examining government violence against peaceful civil rights protesters and the journalists covering them. I want to thank each of our briefers for joining us today. The written testimony you've submitted is riveting and searing and a major contribution to public understanding and discourse about this moment in time. We thank you for it. I also want to thank our colleagues, Representative Mary Gay Scanlon and Representative Jackie Spear, who are not on the subcommittee, but have joined us today. The 8-minute and 46-second videotape strangling and murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin ignited a mass nonviolent movement with Black Lives Matter to demand repair of the broken social contract in America. This mass movement, touching every state, large cities, small towns, farm communities, and suburbs, has won the support of more than 2/3 of the American people in public opinion polls and galvanized the conscience of our nation, provoking rigorous historical analysis and serious legislative action. Police brutality has been an essential element of violent white supremacy and racial injustice for centuries, which is why many of us are proud that we passed in the House last Thursday on a bipartisan basis the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, the most sweeping and comprehensive police reform bill in the history of the United States of America. But the movement against police violence has itself led to serious violations of the First Amendment at the hands of government authorities. And here I refer not just to episodes involving individual police officers, but officials at all levels, from local police chiefs all the way up to the Attorney General and President of the United States. This is the subject and focus of our briefing today. Official violence against First Amendment protests threatens the channels of political and social change in America. It turns the police power of the government against the people themselves. Unjustified, unnecessary, and disproportionate government violence against the people is an attack on democracy itself. It demands immediate and serious response by the people's representatives in Congress. It's true that we live in a society where violence threatens us as citizens in many different ways. Gun violence takes the lives of thousands of Americans every year, which is why we passed H.R. 8 for a universal violent felon background check legislation we hope the Senate will still take up. Domestic violence affects more than 1 million women a year, which is why we reenacted the Violence Against Women Act in 2019, and we hope the Senate will finally take that up too. Lethal violence by racist, white supremacist, and ideological extremist groups has taken the lives of hundreds of Americans over the last several years, including 9 African-American parishioners in 2015 at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Heather Heyer, who was murdered in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, by white supremacist James Alex Fields Jr., 11 Jewish worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh at the hands of neo-Nazi Robert Gregory Bowers, 23 mostly Latino persons killed in a racial massacre at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019 by white supremacist Patrick Crusius, and so on. And even in the current wave of protest, extremist provocateurs like Boogaloo and Identity Europa have sought to infiltrate and instigate violence in the marches and rallies called by groups practicing the traditional nonviolence of Reverend Martin Luther King and the American Civil Rights Movement. Tragically, one federal security officer, David Patrick Underwood, was killed on May 29th, the night of protests in Oakland, California. His sister testified before us movingly in the Judiciary Committee on June 10th. Although his killers had not been apprehended at the time of her testimony, certain members tried to point the finger at Antifa, but the FBI caught the actual culprits and charged 2 men associated with Boogaloo, a right-wing extremist group advocating and planning for race war in the United States, one of whom wrote Boogaloo slogans in blood on the hood of his car. Every kind of violence we see in America, gun violence, domestic violence, white supremacist and extremist violence, is a threat to the people and our police officers too. But today in this briefing, we zero in on the threat of government violence unleashed against the American people because of the content and viewpoint of their political speech, their free assembly, and their demands for redress of grievances. We similarly focus on repressive violence unleashed by the government against reporters and photojournalists exercising their free press rights to cover mass demonstrations related to police brutality. We should never use background conditions of social violence or gender violence or extremist violence to normalize the practice of state violence against the people. As Justice Brandeis observed, our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for the law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. Before I begin my own opening statement, I want to take a moment to play a video compilation of some egregious attacks on protesters that have been caught on camera over the last several weeks of protest. Clerks, please go ahead and play the video. Please keep these images in mind as we begin today's briefings. And now I will recognize myself for an opening statement. Because I'm a professor of constitutional law, people often ask me, what is the most important part of the Constitution? And I'll talk for a minute about representative government and separation of powers and judicial review. And these days, the foreign and domestic emoluments clauses, which prevent government officials theoretically from converting the government into an instrument of self-enrichment and profit. But the truth is that American democracy lives and dies by the First Amendment. It is the heart of our Constitution. And the First Amendment contains 6 rights. And amazingly, President Trump and Attorney General Barr managed to violate and offend every single right contained in the First Amendment when they assembled a secret and unidentified paramilitary squad of federal officers and unleashed pepper spray, tear gas, and rubber bullets on a crowd of peaceful protesters, many of them my constituents, and attending reporters, all in order to clear a path for the president to get uninvited to the St. John's Church, Episcopal Church, so he could perform certainly the most grotesque photo opportunity in the history of the United States, waving someone else's Bible upside down over his head. This violent and cartoonish display of banana Republican values trampled the right to, one, peaceably assemble on the streets and sidewalks without being assaulted by government forces. Two, the right to petition your own government for a redress of grievances without being physically attacked by unidentified federal agents. Three, the right to freedom of speech. Four, the right to free press. Five, the right to free exercise of religion without government officials coming to occupy your church property for political reasons and then barring you from access to your own church the next day. And finally, the right not to have government establish religion by fusing governmental and ecclesiastical power, which is surely what President Trump intended to do in his own inartful and incompetent way by brandishing the Bible like a political prop, provoking outraged responses from both the Episcopal and Catholic bishops of Washington, D.C. for this act of narcissistic idolatry. The performance was both unconstitutional and blasphemous as the president trampled the First Amendment rights of the people so he could violate the First Commandment of the Bible, which a lot of our religious citizens do take seriously. The government's photo op riot in Lafayette Square has been not an aberration from, but an illustration of the kinds of official abuse of the First Amendment rights of the people that we have seen in the traditional public forum of streets and sidewalks and parks over the last 5 weeks. Since Mr. Floyd's murder, over 10,000 people have been arrested. Protesters, journalists, and even members of the clergy have been hit with tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, batons, and more. Police have used citywide curfews as an excuse for intimidation and violence. In Minneapolis, police shouted, "Light them up," and shot paintballs at residents standing on their own front porches for recording police marches after curfew. In Los Angeles, police methodically arrested participants in a peaceful demonstration just because it was after curfew. And in Washington, D.C., police kettled over 100 protesters onto one block and then into one house on Swan Street, waiting outside all night, ready to arrest any protester who tried to go home. There have been disgraceful episodes of violence against protesters, and we will hear unforgettable testimony today from two different women. One, Ms. Ratliff, a citizen protesting, and the other, Ms. Tirado, a journalist who was on the scene, both of whom were shot in the eye in two different protests in two different states. Police have used so-called less than lethal weapons, including tear gas and rubber bullets fired directly at the heads and in the faces of both protesters and journalists. In total, at least 60 people have suffered serious head injuries at the hands of police. At least 20 of these people suffered eye injuries, and at least 7 people have lost an eye. The unprovoked brutality of some of these offenses against citizen protesters are only known because so many Americans refuse to stop exercising the very freedoms that are under attack. Videos captured by journalists and protesters alike have shown police indiscriminately spraying tear gas from their vehicles into crowds, firing rubber bullets in seemingly indiscriminate ways, and clubbing and shoving protesters who are kneeling or walking with their hands in the air. In one of the most haunting videos, America watched as Buffalo police officers shoved a 75-year-old protester to the ground, inflicting a grievous head wound and leaving him motionless. In some instances, videos have forced police to retract false official statements attempting to excuse or deny misconduct. The free press has been targeted. A CNN news crew was arrested live on the air. Cameras have been pulled out of the hands of reporters. In DC and Louisville, Kentucky, news crews were shot with rubber bullets and brutalized with police shields as they live streamed. The president has praised and encouraged this authoritarian response. He's called hundreds of thousands or millions of peaceful protesters terrorists, thugs, anarchists, agitators, looters, and lowlifes. He has consistently placed blame on demonstrators who have been brutalized by the police, going so far as to call that 75-year-old victim of sickening police violence in Buffalo an Antifa provocateur, yet another revealing figment of the presidential imagination. He has repeatedly taunted and threatened protesters, urged officers to get tough with them, and used violent imagery to pour rhetorical kerosene on the fire. He berates and taunts reporters, describes the press as the enemy of the people, and calls any unflattering reports fake news. In American democracy, the free press and reporters are not the enemies of the people. They are the people's best friend. Those who mean to be their own governors, James Madison said, must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And Jefferson said, if I had to choose between having a government without a newspaper or a newspaper without a government, I would not hesitate a moment to choose the latter. This president and those officials that follow him have been at war with the First Amendment, which protects wide open, uninhibited, and robust public debate, loud protest, vigorous controversy, and democratic engagement. Destruction of the civil liberties and rights of the people is the road to authoritarianism. The people in the streets who moved us to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act last Thursday are not the enemies of the people. They are the people. In American democracy, the Constitution, the streets, and the future all belong to the people, not to the government, much less to one person who temporarily occupies public office. Let's protect the precious First Amendment rights of the people with everything we've got. Before I turn this over to Mr. Jordan, I would like to play one additional video compilation, this time of attacks on the press. Clerks, please play the video. Sorry. Many Americans are horrified by these scenes of violence playing out on the streets of the United States. I now recognize our very distinguished ranking member, Mr. Jordan, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We weren't able to see any of the video you just referenced. I wish we could have been able to view that.
Mr. Jordan, it was made available to all the staff, so your office definitely has that. And
yeah,
you
it's
should
nice,
have it.
it's nice to see it during the actual briefing. If you're going to run this like a hearing, it'd be nice to actually see what you're putting out there for folks to see. I think the chairman, look, the chairman in his opening talked about America lives and dies by the First Amendment. He talked about people's rights being trampled. For the past several months, we have seen Democrat mayors, Democrat governors tell American citizens, you can't open your business, you can't go to church, you can't buy a gun, you can't go to your loved one's funeral. We saw, but somehow when it came to the protest, it was all different. We saw the mayor of New York City in early May, 9 protesters pushing for the Empire State to reopen from the coronavirus lockdown were busted outside of City Hall. He told the Jewish community, he said, my message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I've instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. But oh, how that changed. He went from, we're not going to allow any kind of gathering. I don't care if it's 20 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. He went to, a month later during the protest, I want to see a light touch. A light touch. I bet Mr. Ngo wishes that there was more than a light touch from the police in Portland a year ago when he was attacked. We had the mayor of Los Angeles. He ordered utilities to shut off, ordered utility companies to shut off utilities if anyone attempted to reopen their business. So you try to give someone a haircut, they're going to cut off your water. He punished skaters by throwing sand in the state parks, the skate parks. He arrested people going to the beach. We wouldn't want kids skating. We wouldn't want people going to the beach even by themselves. And yet, during the protest a month later, he knelt down while protesters were shouting, defund the police. And as we all know, he wasn't wearing a mask, Mr. Raskin, when he did that. We have the mayor of Minneapolis, who a few months ago said in-person worship services would be a public health disaster. But then he said, we encourage people to exercise caution when they're demonstrating, wearing a mask, physical distancing as much as possible. So how things have changed, and that is my concern. This unequal treatment under the law, it's not supposed to work that way in our country. As the Attorney General said 2 months ago, the Constitution is not suspended during a crisis, and yet, based on the actions we've seen from so many of these individuals, Democrat mayors, Democrat governors, during the coronavirus, prohibiting them from operating, engaging in their livelihood, preventing them from exercising their First Amendment liberties to go to church, preventing them from exercising their Second Amendment liberties to purchase a firearm, preventing them from even going to their loved one's funeral. But when it came to the protest, an entirely different story. And that is my concern. And I hope we get into those issues as well today and hear from our witness. It's interesting, the Democrats put out their press statement today. They included their witnesses, but not the witness that we invited, Mr. Ngo, which is highly unusual. I don't know if that's ever happened in any briefing or hearing I've been a part of. We look forward to hearing from Mr. Ngo and his experience dealing with Antifa, this terrorist organization that has attacked him and threatened him numerous times. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Introduce our briefers today. First, we have Linda Tirado, who is a freelance journalist. Next, we have Gustavo Martinez, a freelance journalist for the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. Next, we have Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Next, we have Latoya Ratliff, an activist and protester. Next, we have Andy Ngo, editor-at-large at the Post-Millennial, who was invited at the request of the minority, Mr. Jordan. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Gerbasi, a constituent of mine and rector at the St. John's Episcopal Church in Georgetown. I would like to note that several of our witnesses are joined by counsel today. Counsel may intercede to advise their clients on whether they may answer a question. I know that there's outstanding litigation in some of the cases that will be discussed today. And if it's necessary, we ask the counsel unmute and identify yourselves before speaking. With that, we will turn to Ms. Tirado. Ms. Tirado has asked that I advise members that due to her injuries, she may at times need to close her eyes or bow her head, but she will still be able to fully participate and to answer our questions. Ms. Tirado, we're extremely grateful to you for joining us today and for speaking out about your experience. You are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, today marks the 1 month anniversary of the last time I will have woken up with sight in both of my eyes. Tomorrow will be the 1 month anniversary of the morning I woke up in a hospital and doctors informed me that I had been blinded in one eye. I had been in Minneapolis for fewer than 48 hours. My name is Linda Tirado, and I am a journalist. I am a writer, a photographer, and a published author. I've covered civil unrest in America since 2014, and my work on this issue has taken me from Ferguson to Chicago to Washington, D.C., to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and finally to Minneapolis. I'm here to bear witness to my own experience. I went to Minneapolis because I expected that George Floyd's death was going to be a catalyst for civil unrest. I arrived in Minneapolis on Thursday, May 28th, and I was out on the streets taking photos until 4 a.m. On Friday, May 29th, I went out again at about 8 p.m. It was the first night with a curfew, but press had been exempted from that so that we could do our jobs and cover the news. I was wearing my usual clothes for these situations, a t-shirt and a pair of shorts with a lot of pockets. I had a backpack and I wore my press credentials conspicuously on a lanyard around my neck. I always carry my reporter's notebook in the right side pocket of my cargo shorts and my recorder in the left. I was also holding my professional grade Nikon camera with a full flash. Protesters could tell immediately that I was working. They asked me more than once who I was working with. Protesters had no trouble identifying me as a journalist. As I've learned from covering other mass protests, these types of events have similar patterns no matter where you go. Police form ranks and push protesters back. Protesters retreat a few blocks, and then a certain détente settles in on both sides while everyone waits to see what will happen next. I arrived during one of those lulls and I took pictures of the police line because it is my job to try to explain to the public what is happening on their streets. On May 29th, when I heard from protesters that police were deploying tear gas nearby to where I was, I put on my goggles and my respirator and headed toward the 5th precinct. I would like to share some of the photographs that I took that night. These photos show clearly what I saw. Here's one of my photographs showing the police during one of the moments I just described. They're holding their line. The photos that I'm going to show you now were among the last pictures I took with my camera on Friday night. I took these in the no man's land between police and protesters, and it's not uncommon for the press to exist in that space, particularly photographers. So this is the 5th from the last photograph I took. It shows an officer loading his gun from the bandolier on his vest. Ballistics experts will probably be able to tell from this photograph what sorts of rounds were being used by the police. I turn now to the 3rd from the last photograph I took. The police are in riot gear and wearing vests that clearly say Minneapolis Police Department. Finally, here is the last photograph that I took before I was shot. You can see an officer pointing his gun directly down my camera lens. You can also see that at least one other officer is pointing their gun at me. You'll also notice in this photograph that a group of officers seem to be milling around on that street corner. This was not a particularly dangerous moment for them. This was a moment of pause. This group of officers were not part of the ranks who had been holding their line. One even seemed like he was using his phone. The photos do not show police that seemed concerned about my presence, nor do I recall feeling as though I were in any imminent danger. I felt confident in my position because I was readily identifiable as press and because I was not impeding the police. I recall lining up a photograph, and then I recall pain and wetness. I registered a dull thud and I realized that I had been hit in the face with something. My goggles came off and tear gas hit my eyes. I realized I was bleeding, so I squeezed my eyes shut and started instinctively screaming, "Press, I'm pressed," hoping that that would protect me. Protesters came and took me by the arm. I recall someone saying they were taking me to the medics. I followed them blindly and let somebody bandage my eye. I did not realize how badly I had been hurt because head wounds bleed freely. So I didn't panic. I thought I might just need a few stitches. Someone put me into their van and drove me to the hospital. Doctors told me I was going into surgery immediately to try to save my eye. I tweeted a photo of my face and a picture of my backpack, which I noticed had been hit with a bright green tracker round because I wanted friends and family to know that I was getting medical care in case someone had seen me on a live stream. I reported it duly and told the world I would be offline for a while because it is a bad idea to tweet when you are under sedation. I woke up the next day in the hospital. I remember doctors coming to tell me that I had lost sight in my left eye. I remember that all I wanted was a whiskey and a steak, or at least like a really artery clogging cheeseburger, but instead I was given extra bananas for the potassium. I called my husband and asked him to fly to Minneapolis to drive me home. He is a veteran who served with the Marine Corps in Fallujah. He's now my nurse, and I joke with him that I've taken more combat injuries than he has. For the first week, I was not allowed to take a shower, and let me tell you, trying to wash tear gas and dried blood out of your own hair in a bathtub without getting water in your face is tough. I smelled of gas and smoke and sharp copper for a week. I could not get the stink off me. I do not know what the rest of my life will be like. I do not know if I'll ever be able to cover protests again, or if my injury will make this work that I've engaged in since 2014 too risky. But I will write and I will report and I will try to do my job as competently as I always have. I am angry, of course, and I am grieving, and I am worried that the United States is becoming a more dangerous place to be a journalist. I have lost an eye, but not any moral clarity. I was shot in the face for being a reporter. I'm grateful that the subcommittee takes up the issue of First Amendment violations at Black Lives Matter protests. I will be as responsive as I can with the hope that we have all seen enough rage and pain and fire. Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee. I look forward to your questions.
For testimony, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your brave service as a journalist and to the people of America. Mr. Martinez, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Raskin, Congressman Jordan, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Gustavo Martinez, and I'm a staff reporter for the Asbury Park Press. I have been a journalist for 16 years and have covered political protests and similar events across 3 countries for more than a decade. Until June 1st, when I was arrested while covering a protest in Asbury Park, New Jersey, I had never been arrested or detained for reporting on a political protest. I speak up today because the silencing of journalists by law enforcement is a fundamental threat to American democracy. A press badge should not be a bullseye. On the morning of June 1st, 2020, I was assigned to cover the Black Lives Matter protest in Asbury Park. That day, I gathered protective gear to take with me that evening, including a safety helmet, protective eyewear, reflective bracelets, and a yellow bandana. I also planned to carry my usual equipment, my iPhone to document action in real time, and my press passes from the New Jersey Police Press Credential Program and from the Asbury Park Press. I wear these badges on a lanyard around my neck. Around 7 p.m. that evening, I put on my press badge and headed over to the protest. For about 2.5 hours, everything was fine. During that time, I spoke with several police officers who asked me why I was there. I explained that I was a reporter. Then, around 9:30, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. First, law enforcement began using a bullhorn to tell people to go home. Next, a police officer approached me, said it was past curfew, and asked me why I was still there. I faced the officer, and with my press badge around my neck, I told him that I was a reporter with the Asbury Park Press and was there to report on the protest. I also explained that reporters were exempt from the Asbury Park curfew. He just looked at me and said, quote, "So you want a taste of the action? You'll get a taste of the action then," end quote. Soon after, I saw officers in riot gear arrive at the area. I double-checked that my press badge was clearly visible and immediately put on my helmet and protective eyewear. I continued live streaming the events around me. Around 10 p.m., I stood with other members of the press, and we suddenly found ourselves in a group of protesters who were being forcibly pushed out of the area by our Asbury Park police. I stood to the side with other members of the media who were documenting what was happening. As I stood there, I heard screams. I, along with other journalists, turned and headed in the direction they came from. I saw people being pepper sprayed by the police. I headed towards them to document what was happening. I heard another scream. I turned again and saw Asbury Park police pushing 2 young protesters, a man and a woman. I heard the young woman say that they were leaving when suddenly the young man was tackled to the ground and handcuffed by several police officers. The young woman, who I later learned was his sister, tried to intervene on his behalf, but a police officer grabbed her and slammed her onto the ground. I was live streaming on my phone as this happened. Then I heard, quote, "F him, he is the problem," end quote. And from the corner of my eye, I saw a large police officer launching toward me. A moment later, I found myself tackled to the ground. My iPhone was still recording as I was knocked to the ground, but the live stream went dark just as the police officer who tackled me screamed, quote, "You're under arrest. Put your effing hands behind your back," end quote. No sooner had I hit the ground than another officer yelled, quote, "Take down his effing phone," end quote. The phone was slapped out of my hand. My press badge was around my neck the entire time, and I even verbally identified myself to one of the arresting officers as a reporter. I was handcuffed and handed over to another officer to be loaded onto a van with other individuals under arrest. That officer saw my badge and asked what it was. I said it was a press badge and that I was a reporter, and he and the other officers then stripped me of my helmet, reflective bracelets, protective eyewear, bandana, and backpack. My press badge was still around my neck when they loaded me into the van to police headquarters. More than 5 hours later, I was released from jail. The next morning, I learned that all pending charges against me had been dropped when New Jersey Attorney General Gerbasi issued a public apology and tweeted that, quote, "In America, we don't lock up reporters for doing their job," end quote. I also received a personal call from him where he once again apologized. My experience on the night of June 1st at the Asbury Park protest continues to haunt me. There is no question in my mind that I was targeted, tackled, and arrested because I was reporting on the events around me, even though the First Amendment protects my right to do so. I hope that by speaking out today, it helps to ensure that countless other journalists are able to freely report the news without censorship by law enforcement. Thank you very much.
Testimony and for stepping forward to give us that, Mr. Martinez. We are now going to go to Latoya Ratliff, who will be introduced by her representative in Congress, Ms. Wasserman Schultz. I asked her to say a few words about Ms. Ratliff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very proud to introduce Latoya Ratliff, an activist and fellow South Floridian, whose courage inspired our community and the nation. Ms. Ratliff was among the millions of people nationwide who peacefully assembled in recent weeks to demand an end to police brutality and racial injustice. Ms. Ratliff attended a peaceful protest on May 31st in Fort Lauderdale that called for racial justice, following in the footsteps of her great aunt, Fannie Lou Hamer, the civil rights leader who organized voter registration drives and fought against white supremacy in the Jim Crow South. Just regrettably, just like her great aunt before her, Ms. Ratliff faced indefensible acts of violence while exercising her First Amendment rights. As she held a protest sign and retreated in a cloud of tear gas, an officer shot her with a rubber bullet, fracturing her skull and causing lasting damage and pain. I'm so honored to welcome Ms. Ratliff, and I'm so pleased she joined us today to share more about this harrowing experience and lessons we can all learn from it. Fighting for justice is clearly in her DNA, and I am so proud to be able to introduce her to you this morning. I yield back.
I know that Ms. Ratliff's counsel has asked that before she goes ahead to do her testimony that we play a brief video showing the moment that she was shot by the police. In the clip that will follow, viewers can see Ms. Ratliff being shot near the center of the screen at about 19 seconds into the video. I understand that Ms. Ratliff does not wish to see the video herself being played, so she doesn't have to relive the trauma of the event. So Ms. Ratliff, I will let you know when it is safe to open your eyes so that you may go ahead and launch your testimony. Clerks, please go ahead and play this video. Ms. Ratliff, the video is now over. As with Ms. Tirado, Mr. Martinez, I feel ashamed and shocked about the way you were treated by the agents of our government, and I thank you for being here to discuss your experience. You are now recognized to give your statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ranking members of the committee, good morning. My name is Latoya Ratliff, and I work for a national religious nonprofit organization. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to share my story today. In 1964, my great aunt, Fannie Lou Hamer, told the story of how she and 17 other freedom riders risked their lives to register to vote, and how police were used to intimidate, assault, and violate the civil rights of she and other citizens who had broken no laws, but had simply attempted to exercise their right to register. They called her nigger, arrested her, and took her to a cell where she was beaten mercilessly. My great aunt was famously sick and tired of being sick and tired. I never met Fannie Lou Hamer, but I've always felt her spirit with me as I've exercised my First Amendment rights to speak out against racial inequality in policing. She suffered permanent injuries at the hands of the police. I still don't know if I have. As I sit here today, I have little to no vision in my right eye. Doctors don't know if that will change. Like hundreds of millions of people around the world, I was shocked and disgusted by the murder of George Floyd. I wanted to do something. I heard about civil demonstrations and I joined in. I have first attended one in Miami on May 30th. We exercised our First Amendment rights without incident of violence from the police. Because of this experience, I decided to attend another demonstration the following afternoon. As I walked through Fort Lauderdale that day, I looked around. I saw a diverse group of people who shared a common goal. I saw young and old, wealthy and poor, Black, white, Hispanic, and every other demographic you could imagine. At one point, we took a knee to show that we were no threat and meant the police no harm. At other demonstrations, the police actually joined the demonstrators. Not here. The police began firing tear gas and shooting rubber bullets. I will forever be scarred by the Fort Lauderdale police shooting me in the head on May 31st. Officer Eliezer Ramos shot me, a peaceful demonstrator, an unarmed woman in the head with a rubber bullet. While merely exercising my First Amendment right to speak out against police brutality, I became the type of victim that I was there to support. 25 days after incident reports were filed, which make no claim that I did anything unlawful or wrong, I still await an apology from Officer Ramos, Chief Maglione, or anyone in leadership in the city of Fort Lauderdale. Rather than an apology, what I have received from the city is repeated criticism of my decision to exercise my First Amendment rights. Less than 48 hours ago, the chief issued yet another statement in which he attacked me for speaking to you today. I have sought a meeting with the city, but rather than speak to me, the police department seems intent on continuing their attack on me. Since demonstrating their disdain for the First Amendment on May 31st, they have continued their assault on my First Amendment rights in the months since. I know they're watching this morning, so I'd like to say this as clearly as I can. If you want to work together to make needed reforms, I'm ready to sit down and talk. But if you think you're going to silence me with rubber bullets or attempt to intimidate me through statements to the press, you've thought wrong. While I seem to be the person who was most significantly injured at the hands of the Fort Lauderdale police that day, I am by no means the only one. A published photo seems to show the damage done to a young man who was shot in the face. Multiple witnesses claim to have seen two Black men shot from behind with rubber bullets as they escaped tear gas. A white photographer ran between them and was not shot. I appreciate those people who honor the oath they took and demonstrate the courage and sacrifice and dedication so many of us associate with the badge. It takes a special kind of person to be willing to run towards dangers when others run from it. But too often, police unions make the rules which allow bad cops to continue to abuse their power and the public. Too often, the systems which are supposed to create accountability and justice end up failing, and sometimes even after someone is murdered. In the civil rights era of my great aunt, they fought for incremental change. Though I recognize that progress is often achieved incrementally, the time for incremental improvements to equality and justice for people who look like me has passed. We must entirely close the gap that divides the treatment of most of you enjoy and the treatment that millions of Black people in this country suffer. I sit here today because Miami journalists Sarah Blasky and Nicholas Nehamas told my story, and because of countless of others who have dedicated themselves to be the eyes and ears of the public. I want Black people in America to come to a point where a routine traffic stop doesn't make them fear for their lives, where protests are unnecessary, But if they do become necessary, no one's life is at risk for exercising their First Amendment rights. It is truly grueling to watch videos of trauma, let alone be the victim in one. For Black people, we have lived in this country for far too long without truly being free and without truly being safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very eloquent and powerful statement. And like you, I never got to meet the great Fannie Lou Hamer, but you are your great aunt's great niece. And I dare say that if she were here today, or if she were watching down on you, she'd be very proud of your courage in following in her path of creative and brave nonviolence to confront injustice. So thank you for what you're doing. We go now to Dean Brown-Nagin. You are now recognized, Dean Brown-Nagin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Tamika Brown-Nagin. I'm Dean of the Ratliff Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University and also Professor of Constitutional Law and History at Harvard. I'm honored to have been asked to offer testimony on a subject of such great importance. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the rights of speech, assembly, and protest, and it is sacrosanct. The right to air grievances against government, including law enforcement, distinguishes democracies such as ours from repressive regimes. As Supreme Court Justice William Brennan noted in a landmark case, the freedom of individuals to oppose or challenge police action without thereby risking arrest is one of the principal characteristics by which we distinguish a free nation from a police state. Nevertheless, the long arc of American history shows that the rule of law is often tested during times of social conflict, political turbulence, and economic distress. During the Great Depression, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and in recent weeks, during protests following the police killing of George Floyd, some police officers have ignored the principles enshrined in the First Amendment. Now, we must not hesitate to acknowledge that law enforcement includes many individuals who honor their responsibility to safeguard the rights and dignity of all communities. A number of these officers have been among those demanding justice for George Floyd. Even so, a legacy of repression lives on in the actions of some, and it must be addressed. As an historian of the Civil Rights Movement, that is the period from which I will draw examples. In Memphis, more than 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his final address in support of striking sanitation workers after a court had enjoined plans for a march. Although King was familiar with government violence, Bull Connor's fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham in 1963, Bloody Sunday in Selma in 1965, among many other incidents, he implored those gathered to hold our nation to his principles. He said in part, "All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they hadn't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right." The next day, the court lifted its injunction, allowing the march to continue. King, cut down by an assassin's bullet, would not be there, but we still hear his message in our streets today. Since the 1960s, there have been significant changes in the relationship between government and African Americans and between law enforcement and communities of color. At the same time, we have witnessed recent violations of the rights of protesters that recall earlier backlash against peaceful efforts to ensure government accountability and equality. Many of these incidents have been captured on video and by journalists. An appendix to my written testimony provides an extensive listing. To be clear, government can regulate the time, place, and manner of protests, and cities and states can impose curfews in pursuance of public safety, but such regulations are strictly limited by the Constitution. Government cannot penalize the peaceful expression of views, even unpopular ones, and even, perhaps especially, strident criticisms of public officials and public policies. And this is true, even if similar activities in the past led to or involved violence. To uphold the First Amendment and equal treatment under the law, government cannot discriminate on the basis of viewpoint in 2020 any more than it could in 1963. It is crucial that the individuals entrusted with upholding and enforcing the law do more than observe this bedrock principle of our democracy. They must protect it. Thank you.
Dean Brown-Nagin, thank you very much for that discussion of the fundamental importance of government respect for the First Amendment rights of the people. I appreciate that. And we go now to Mr. Ngo. You are recognized, Mr. Ngo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin, Ranking Member Jordan, and committee members. I'm a journalist who reports on American political violence. By speaking to you today, I'm putting my life in my own hands. For years, I've been the victim of hundreds of threats by Antifa extremists. They threatened to kill me. They spread lies about me being a fascist, a neo-Nazi, even a terrorist. They showed up to my family's home in the middle of the night. And they nearly killed me when they beat me in broad daylight, within view of the police, in the middle of downtown Portland last year. I spent 30 hours in hospital as my brain bled from subarachnoid hemorrhage. This past week, "Murder Andy Ngo" was written on a large wall in downtown Portland next to the Antifa slogan, ACAB, all cops are bastards. I received more threats when it was announced that I would be speaking to this committee. I am in fear, but the truth is too important to remain silent. I've seen the photos of the injuries sustained by my co-panelists. They're absolutely horrific. Their complaints must be taken seriously and properly investigated. However, it is incomplete to focus on injuries perpetuated by law enforcement during the past month of riots without examining the violent extremists, like Antifa and others, who instigate and carry out violence from the cover of peaceful demonstrations. From coast to coast, American cities have been convulsed with riots that have now claimed dozens of lives, injured hundreds, and cost countless millions in damages. Over-policing did not cause this. Violent extremists and criminals did. In Portland, Oregon, where I do most of my reporting, violent protests have continued for more than 30 days. Like in many cities, law enforcement here is routinely demonized by the public and elected officials. I reported earlier this year for Newsweek about how the mainstreaming of police hatred in Portland has created a culture of passive policing and a tolerance of criminal mob behavior. On the evening of the 29th of May, 2020, violent rioting spread to Portland. After rioters stormed and set fire to the ground floor of the Justice Center, which houses the Central Police Precinct and the Sheriff's Office, they turned their rage to downtown businesses. Many were opportunists looking to carry out carnage, but I also saw Antifa militants dressed in their black uniforms taking a leadership role in smashing windows and breaking into windows so that looters could pillage. In a span of 5 hours, they destroyed countless businesses and started fires with impunity. You could hear the distant sirens of the police, but no one would show up. Police in Portland and elsewhere have sustained serious injuries from rocks, concrete chunks, IEDs, and more. The weapons Antifa extremists use are intentionally designed to be deceptive to legal observers, media, and those around them. For example, projectiles that may look like water balloons are actually filled with paint and used to blind police before they're pelted with rocks. Umbrellas are fastened with discreet pocket knives at the end. Projectiles that look like plastic water bottles are actually frozen solid. Innocuous-looking handheld lasers are shined in an officer's eyes before someone with a slingshot aims ball bearings at his face. In New York,
Hey, Candace?
nearly 400 officers in a 2-week period. 150 local and federal officers were injured in Washington, D.C. in a week. Police have been shot and killed elsewhere. I've seen with my own eyes how Antifa and other violent extremists use peaceful protests to carry out acts of wanton violence against property, law enforcement, and citizens. When I was undercover in Seattle's so-called autonomous zone, which was inhabited by many Antifa, I received manuals and booklets providing instructions on how to use protesters as human shields and cover. These are organized and committed violent extremists who look to destabilize the country. They are trained to use encrypted means of communication to hide their trail. Those who get injured or arrested are regular protesters and even journalists. Antifa melt away into the black bloc. The First Amendment is paramount, but street protests must be constrained by the rule of law. Law enforcement play one of the most important roles in keeping demonstrations safe. We've seen how this can work. During protests in DC at the end of last month, self-described Antifa Legba Carrefour was recorded in a viral video hammering chunks off the street to throw at police. Peaceful protesters made a citizen's arrest and handed him over to law enforcement. He's been charged. George Floyd deserves justice, but so do countless Americans, journalists, and others victimized by militant extremists who use us as human shields. Thank you.
Mr. Ngo. And now, Reverend Gerbasi, you are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Chairman Raskin, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to today's briefing. My name is Ginny Gerbasi, and I serve as the rector at St. John's Episcopal Church in Georgetown. Before assuming my current role 6 years ago, I previously served on the clergy staff of St. John's Lafayette Square. It was my ministry that brought me to Lafayette Square on the afternoon of June 1st. The day before, during my sermon, I looked directly into the camera on my laptop because that's how I was preaching that day. And I called the church as a whole, to account for its lack of courage and leadership in dismantling systemic racism. That Sunday was the Feast of Pentecost, when Christians celebrate receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit. And I lamented that literally for centuries, the church has squandered this mighty gift and has not had the courage to stand up and cast out the evil of systemic and institutional racism from our civic body in the name of love. Racial justice, rooted in Scripture, is now a critical ministry of the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Washington. And it was that ministry, at the invitation of my bishop, that drew me and my colleagues to St. John's Lafayette Square. That Monday, I was there on behalf of the church to provide comfort and support to the peaceful protesters and to stand in solidarity with them and with the cause of racial justice. I was there in support of people protesting the government's use of violence and brutality against innocent people. And with my own eyes, I saw the government use brutality and violence against peaceful people. To be clear, that day was marked by peaceful protests. Our group of clergy was based on what I call the patio of St. John's Lafayette Square, a large outdoor area on the corner of H and 16th Street, regularly used by the church for gatherings and for ministry. We were passing out water, snacks, hand sanitizer, masks, and trying to ensure that the patio area was a place of respite and peace for the people gathered. It struck me that the patio had also become a deeply spiritual place that day. I called it holy ground. And while you may not think that Episcopalians do this, we were literally laying hands on people and praying with them. We offered them spiritual comfort and support. People sat in the shade and on the steps as a place of peace and respite. I would venture into the crowds right around that corner, offering water and snacks. You could hear the people with megaphones inside the park leading the crowd in protests like, no justice, no peace, no racist police. For hours that afternoon, it was absolutely peaceful. And then sometime after 6:15, things changed in an instant. Suddenly, I saw and heard protesters running from Lafayette Park. I saw trails of smoke and billowing clouds of acrid smoke billowing through the crowds. People began to run north on 16th Street and pile onto the patio, some of them crying and asking for help, asking for paper towels or water, or their eyes were streaming with tears and their eyes were stinging. The first flash grenade rang out, sounding like gunfire, and I saw people dropping to the ground in fear that it was gunfire. I remember looking at my watch because I couldn't understand what had happened to trigger this sudden change in the behavior of the police. It was 6:36, well before the 7 o'clock curfew. I was on the patio of St. John's Lafayette Square and right across the street from Lafayette Park. I hadn't heard any warning. I hadn't heard any message from the police. The first thing I heard were the screams of people running. People were running, crying, dropping to the ground in terror. It was dehumanizing. As the protesters ran from the park, I called out, "Water, eyewash," in an attempt to assist the fleeing protesters. A man knelt in front of me, coughing and terrified, his eyes swollen and red. He begged for something to help the stinging, and I began to rinse his eyes. I heard someone yell rubber bullets, and I looked up from washing the man's eyes to see a man in front of me holding his stomach and bent over. He moved his arms, and I saw marks on his shirt. And then I looked over his shoulder, and I could not believe my eyes. A wall of police in full riot gear was physically pushing people off the St. John's patio, maybe 15 feet away from me. The scene was shocking, and the terrified faces of the protesters continue to haunt me. They were peacefully protesting, and the government used violence against them. That alone left me badly shaken. But when I later found out that the president had, just minutes later, stood in front of the church and held up a Bible, I was outraged. My clergy colleagues and I were there in the name of those same scriptures. But we were praying with people, giving them water and food, and then, after they were attacked by the police, first aid care. To hold up those same scriptures after using tear gas and rubber bullets and flash grenades and police in riot gear was horrifying. And I say this not to make a political point, but to raise an objective truth. The scene I witnessed would have been equally devastating regardless of who was occupying the White House. The following Wednesday, although there was no more tear gas or rubber bullets, police in full riot gear, not wearing any identifying information, blocked us from getting to a prayer vigil at the church. Let me reiterate that. We were not permitted to gather at our church to pray. And this, like the events of June 1st, is antithetical to everything we hold dear in this country. It's antithetical to my faith, both individually and as a clergy person, and should be abhorrent to people of all faiths. I am here today to offer my account of these events, but more broadly, to add my voice to the chorus demanding racial justice, and to ensure that what happened in Lafayette Square that evening will never happen again. And I look forward to answering your questions.
Reverend Gerbasi, thank you very much for your eloquent testimony. I understand that Representative Wasserman Schultz is about to board an airplane, but would have her 5 minutes now to do her questioning. Am I correct, Debbie?
Yes.
I'm
Mr.
coming
Chairman.
to you then.
Thank you so much. And first of all, really, my kudos to you for convening this important briefing. It is absolutely critical that we use our authority as the Committee on Oversight and Reform to shine a bright hot spotlight on these abuses of power and the harm that are coming to people from simply standing up and expressing their First Amendment rights. And that's exactly what people were doing in Fort Lauderdale when Latoya Ratliff was badly injured. I remember seeing the accounts on TV, and right after all of this happened, speaking to friends and constituents who participated in this rally and protest for racial justice. Ms. Ratliff, as I understand it, I have to tell you, it was just absolutely astonishing to me that that in our community that we could have had this kind of police overreaction. But as I understand it, at the protest that you attended in Fort Lauderdale, police tear gassed the crowd of protesters and then fired foam bullets. Did you hear any warning before either the tear gas or the rubber bullets were fired? And I also want to understand the ramifications, what the ramifications have been for you for showing up to this protest. Can you describe some of what your life has been like since your injury? I mean, we're talking about, Mr. Chairman, people standing up for their First Amendment rights, and they shouldn't end up, as a result of doing that, being gravely injured and having physical and emotional ramifications for the rest of their life. Ms. Ratliff?
Thank you, Congresswoman. At no point prior to being tear gassed or prior to the firing of rubber bullets was there ever a verbal warning. Unfortunately, the warning that the protesters and demonstrators were provided were being tear gassed. And even as we were being tear gassed, as we've seen from videos, then people were still being shot by rubber bullets. And unfortunately, after what happened to me, there still wasn't any type of verbal warning or acknowledgement from the officers to say, bring her here or come over and help me as well. And since that day, and actually for a little over the first week after what happened, I couldn't chew for over a week. I was actually kind of surviving off of smoothies and soups. Beyond that, my eye, I still have vision issues in my eye. I still have extreme light sensitivity. I'm still unable to look at the computer. So if you see me, sometimes I'm veering off. And I have to continuously look away because, just my daily routine of working and looking on the computer and trying to write grants and trying to, perform social media outreach for different organizations, I'm no longer able to do that. So as a person who went to the Fort Lauderdale protest to, simply exercise my First Amendment rights, coming from that situation, not only being a victim, but a lot of the goals that I wanted to achieve afterwards consisted of connecting with community organizations and being able to help them with funding, and also being able to help them with any initiatives that they were looking to create or generate momentum around in regards to the police brutality issues. And because of what happened to me, I'd have to put that on the back burner for now.
Thank you very much. But Mr. Chairman, by all accounts, I had firsthand accounts immediately as the violence was unfolding, and by all accounts, this was a peaceful protest. And mayhem ensued after the police overreacted towards the end of the protest. So, Ms. Ratliff, what message does it send in your belief when police shoot at a peaceful protester as she marches against police violence, or knocks over, as also happened during this protest, a peaceful protester who was on their knees? And what message does it send to protesters and people who want to stand up for what they believe in and express their First Amendment rights in the future?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And thank you for mentioning what actually took the demonstration from peaceful to the state of the chaos that ensued. And as we've seen in other videos, there was a young woman that was kneeling on the ground and an officer shoved her. And that was the pivotal moment that took it from the peaceful day, that took it from that community rally and people coming together simply to exercise their First Amendment rights and simply to be a part of change. Seeing that video and actually recognizing that that was the moment that actually took the crowd from peaceful, and understanding that it was never anything from the individuals that attended the rally. It was never them saying, we want to bring violence to this administration. It was the officers that created the violence. And knowing that even after that situation had calmed down, the officers still from there were still, coming with tear gas, and they were still shooting rubber bullets. And what it means to me, and what it comes off to the community as, is that even though they are enlisted, the City of Fort Lauderdale Police Department, they're put there to protect and serve. They're put there to protect the lives of the community. At that point, and at that moment of me being shot and afterwards, the 4 weeks after the incident, I don't know if that's accurate anymore. I don't know if I feel comfortable attending events in Fort Lauderdale where the police are present, because again, I haven't received an apology. I haven't received an acknowledgement of the trauma, the physical and emotional trauma that I endured and that I'm going to continue to endure. So as a citizen that was there, that was peaceful, that was simply wanting to be a part of change, and seeing the police brutality that I was met with, it just comes off as they don't care, or as they didn't want us to be able to express our opinions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your indulgence. And Ms. Ratliff, I hope and trust that because of your family history of leadership and standing up for justice and human rights, that we will see you out there standing up for what you believe in once again. And Mr. Chairman, the last thing on earth in the United States of America that should happen is people having their First Amendment rights snuffed out through intimidation by those that are there to serve and protect. Thank you so much for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. I'm going to recognize myself for my 5 minutes. Ms. Ratliff, let me just pick up on that. You said that it was the officers who created the violence. You didn't see any rioting or looting taking place? You need to unmute.
Sorry.
Can you unmute?
No, Mr. Chairman, I'd been at the demonstration for over 3 hours. We'd walked to multiple locations. I spoke to several individuals that attended the rally. And at no point during those 3 hours did anyone become violent. Did anyone express the need to become violent or the desire to become violent? And as I've seen from the video and just the timing of the video of the girl being shoved by the police officer, that's the only thing that I can recognize that shifted the peaceful momentum of the event to the chaos that ensued.
That's what broke the ice. But I've got one other question for you. You, in fact, serve on a police reform board in order to try to help police build stronger community relationships. Is that right?
Yes, I was appointed to the Police Advisory Committee for the City of Delray Beach a few months ago, about a month and a half prior to quarantine. I actually spent about 6 or 7 months applying, and finally I was able to be nominated to be on the board.
Well, why did you apply?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Why did you want to do that? Why did you want to serve in that way?
Because even as we look at the issues that the Black community suffers from police brutality or the issues, I think there's always a place to fix that damaged relationship. I think as we continue to look at ways to discuss reform, I think one of the biggest things that we can do is look at rebuilding the relationship with police officers in all communities, and specifically the Black community. So being able to be an active agent in that change and being someone that could offer advice on different initiatives and different approaches to rebuild those relationships is very important to me. Because if the officers that are patrolling the communities, if those citizens know the officers, if the officers know the citizens and know that they're good people and know that they don't mean any harm, then my hope is that that will reduce the incidence of police brutality.
Thank you very much. Reverend Gerbasi, first of all, as a representative for a lot of people who were caught up in that paramilitary riot that was staged by Attorney General Barr and President Trump in Lafayette Square, I want to thank you for trying to shield people from the violence and the tear gas and the rubber bullets and so on. I wonder if you would, you relive for us that scene of horror and also your shock at being displaced from your own church property, both by an advancing police phalanx and also the next day when you weren't even allowed to enter your own church. But I wonder if you would comment on some of the police tactics that you experienced in terms of the pandemic that we're in the middle of. Every medical authority has told people to be wearing masks in public and to try to maintain social distance. What did the use of a tear gas, pepper spray, and these rubber bullets do to people's ability to obey the best medical advice in the middle of the pandemic?
So first, I just want to clarify that that the church that I'm the rector or head pastor of is a different St. John's. It's in Georgetown. I had served on the clergy staff of St. John's Lafayette Square, and it is an Episcopal church, and I was there as part of that ministry.
Right, but they were unable to get into their church the day
Exactly.
after, on June 2nd.
And the whole diocesan prayer vigil, all of the clergy and our bishop and clergy from around the city gathered there for a vigil at St. John's Lafayette Square, and we were not able, the police kept us from getting there. So then your question about COVID and the masks. My experience at the protest was that everybody was wearing a mask. People were also regularly coming to us and asking for hand sanitizer. Outdoors, we've been told by public health officials that the risk of spreading COVID is lesser outdoors. And the whole experience of being outdoors where everybody is moving around and people mostly keeping a distance from each other, I felt no concern at all about COVID. My concern later became when the people whose eyes I was washing out, and I'm thinking first of the first man whose eyes I was washing out, he was coughing and coughing, and he pulled his mask down because he was coughing. And I had to lean in close to be able to clear out his eyes. And although I kept my own mask on, I realized several days later that that was the first of what turned out to be several very close, intimate encounters I had with people who had had to pull their masks down so that I could effectively wash their eyes and who were coughing. I was also coughing because I didn't mention it earlier, but I had also gotten tear gas. And unlike Linda, was able to wash the tear gas out of my hair that night.
Thank you very much, Reverend Gerbasi. My time is up, and out of deference to Ms. Wasserman Schultz, we've let her go first, so I'm going to call on our distinguished ranking member to go, and then we'll go also to the Republican side after him. So, Mr. Jordan, you're recognized for your 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ngo, why do Democrats try to ignore you? I mean, Mr. Raskin, the chairman of the committee, couldn't even put your name on the notice that went out to the press notice that went out about this hearing. Why do you think they try to ignore you?
I don't know if it's intentional. I want to try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think I would hope it's not intentional because my message is not a partisan one. I've written for very major publications about this violent extremist threat. My family is based in Portland, Oregon, which is the epicenter of Antifa militant violence. We've had 30 straight days of violent rioting in downtown. Last week, they barricaded the North Precinct and set it on fire when police were inside. So this is the reality of what I'm seeing on the ground every day through my reporting.
Mr. Ngo, let me ask you this. Last week on the House floor, the Democrat chairman of the Judiciary Committee said imaginary things like Antifa. Is Antifa real?
Yes, it's real. When I heard that, I was quite surprised. I hope it was just out of ignorance and not out of political expediency. I'm holding up for you here an affidavit from the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. Okay, I'll just read you from it. Shemrowitz stated they started the fire using a Molotov cocktail and she is part of Antifa. Shemrowitz was reported to be extremely excited about being labeled a terrorist and was very animated about her hopes that police officers would be killed and injured by the riots. Now, this individual here has been charged with numerous felonies for arson, riots, and other crimes. This is a press release from Travis County, Texas, DA's office, and that I'll read from this. The 3 people arrested are known members of a local anti-government group, which is a self-identified communist socialist Antifa group. The damage to property and merchandise stolen is valued at over $20,000. So it's not a conspiracy theory. That's the information warfare term. We need to come together as Americans to counter violent extremists on the far right and the far left.
I couldn't agree more. Do you agree with the president's designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization?
Yes, based on the activities, I see what they're doing on the ground. Let me tell you how sophisticated their organizing is. So in Portland, we've had 2 arrests, these individuals. The woman on the left, Asara Butler, you know what she's accused of? Police said that she's been charged with multiple felonies. They say that on the 2nd of June, she was part of a unit who was driving around during a violent riot in downtown and resupplying her comrades with weapons and more supplies. When police attempted to question and then detain her, she sped off, hit other cars, and the only way they could stop her was by using a strip of spikes. And she injured an officer in the process of being arrested. The man on the right, Dakota Lee Lathrop, he was allegedly driving a car with a fake license plate from North Carolina. When police pulled him over because of suspicious behavior, they found his weapon filled with a cache of weapons.
Mr. No, why didn't the police intervene last year when we've all seen the video, or at least I've seen the video of you being attacked when you were exercising your First Amendment liberties as part of freedom of the press? Why didn't the police intervene when the police were right there seeing what was going on and seeing you being attacked?
Portland is a few years ahead of what the rest of America is experiencing ever since Donald Trump's surprise election win at the end of November in 2016. There's been consistent, routine violent rioting in Portland involving Antifa and people on the right, street brawls, very brutal clashes, and police have been demonized over and over for responding.
Have they been
trying to stop these riots?
Have they been instructed by the mayor and the city council not to intervene in these situations?
Well, I don't have the evidence of that, but our mayor is also a police commissioner, and he's made his dislike of the police pretty clear at times. So through my own reporting, I've just found out that this culture of police hatred has created an environment where police are passive and they're tolerating mob violence. And, we're seeing some data coming out now in the weeks since some of the rioting broke out at the end of last month, showing the increase of violence all across America as police are retreating.
Yep.
So I fear that America is experiencing what Portland is.
I'm about out of time. So, Mr. No, let me ask you one more question. It's about this double standard. As you know, the city council in Minneapolis voted unanimously to disband the police department in Minneapolis. But we find out today, according to news reports, that members of the city council who voted to eliminate the local police are being protected by private security details. And not just being protected by private security details, they're using taxpayer dollars to pay for that protection. Give me your thoughts on this obvious double standard.
Public elected officials need to be protected from terrorists and those who seek to harm them. And you know who else deserves to also be protected by law enforcement? Regular civilians, regular citizens, people like my co-panelists and people like myself.
Thank you, Mr. No. The gentleman's time has expired, and we will go now to Representative Presley for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin, for bringing us together for this important conversation. And I want to thank our briefers for joining us and our survivors of violence for lifting their traumatic experiences. I want to especially thank Dean Brown-Nagin for joining us from the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District. She's a constituent, and I thank you for sharing your compelling testimony and historically contextualizing testimony, and I'll pick up on that in a moment. A few weeks ago, I stood proudly among thousands of my fellow Bostonians at a demonstration in Franklin Park. It was a beautiful sight to bear witness to, a multiracial, multi-generational coalition peacefully protesting, demonstrating, standing up and speaking out in one voice against systemic inequities, structural racism, police brutality, which has robbed us of Black and Brown lives. These peaceful demonstrations are a continuation of the long-time work in organizing of many Black and Brown freedom writers and freedom fighters before them, who have fought to gain and had to fight to gain equal rights for centuries. And while the chants may have changed, the violent tactics used by law enforcement against many of these peaceful demonstrators are eerily similar to those used in other chapters, dark chapters, in our nation's history. In 1965, on Bloody Sunday, television viewers around the country watched as state and local police use billy clubs, whips, and tear gas to attack hundreds of civil rights protesters, including our esteemed colleague, Congressman John Lewis, as they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Dean Nagin, I'd like to really couch this moment in our nation's history. How many of the protests following the death of George Floyd fit this civil rights tradition in our country?
Thank you, Representative Presley. I would say that so many of these protests are reminiscent of the peaceful protests of the civil rights era that were vital to the change in the law and change in society that our country is so appreciative of today. The marchers in Roxbury, on the Boston Common, throughout the country are really participating in an honorable and so critically important tradition of citizens demanding accountability from government, of citizens seeking change in a peaceful way. We ought to be happy in this country that citizens are choosing this honorable pathway to pursue reform. It is their right, and we ought to lift them up for engaging in that manner.
Thank you. And Ranking Member Jordan earlier was talking about equal protection under the law and his experience of violation of the First Amendment in the wake of a pandemic. And, the ironic thing is the reason why there is unrest in our streets is because Black Americans have never had equal protection under the law. That's why they're in the streets in the midst of a pandemic and are being met with more of a police state, which is the very reason why there is an uprising. And the protesters that are on the front lines today would have been the Diane Nagins and the John Lewises and the Dr. Kings of the early days of the civil rights movement. We've seen the viral footage, law enforcement officers in Philadelphia using tear gas on individuals trapped on an embankment, police shooting rubber bullets, leaving severe and irreparable physical and emotional damage and trauma. Dean Nagin, how do these historical images compare to the images we've seen throughout history?
Thank you for that question. Well, as I emphasized in my testimony, the images are in some instances eerily similar to the tactics of people like Bull Connor, Sheriff Clark, and Selma, and other figures whose points of view and whose tactics we had thought we had left behind in 50 years ago or so in this era of American history that we believe is inconsistent with the values of equal protection under the law. And one of the things that is somewhat curious is that the lesson that one sees in history from those moments of violent clash between police and protesters is that it tends to crystallize the injustice of the moment. And
Exactly.
I think that is what we have seen here. When Americans see the injustice that others have lived with for so many years and have been talking about, when they see these images that illustrate these problems, many Americans who are people of good faith, who support the principles of the Constitution, who support equal rights and equal justice, have joined the perspective, have understood the perspective of the protesters. And so the police violence is actually counterproductive. It's counterproductive. It exposes.
I'm short of time, so thank you, Dean. I want to reclaim my time just for as I close here. Obviously, one glaring difference between the situations in Selma and Lafayette Square is the reaction of the person in the Oval Office. In 1965, following the work of civil rights organizers and demonstrators, President Johnson pushed for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Meanwhile, the current occupant of the White House, on the other hand, has encouraged aggressive law enforcement to dominate the streets, demonize protesters, and to promote protection of property over human life. Just last week, he signed an executive order threatening to withhold federal funds from states unless they enforce up to a 10-year sentence for vandalism and damage of Confederate statues. 10 years. While militarized police officers face zero consequences for inciting violence and engaging in reckless and deadly brutality at protests. When the people spoke up and demanded justice, President Johnson used federal forces to protect Black Americans. Today, Donald Trump is using federal forces to attack Black Americans.
Thank you, Ms. Presley. The gentlelady's time has expired. And we're going to come now to Mr. Keller. Before I recognize him, I just wanted to say I asked my staff to check on this, and the ranking member is correct that there was a mix-up on the press release, which I knew nothing about. But Mr. Ngo's name is indeed on the website, and we thank you very much for your participation and your presence here today, Mr. Ngo. I now recognize Mr. Keller for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm glad we're having this meeting today. I'm somewhat disappointed that we aren't following the hearing structure the House passed in HRES 965. If we're going to continue with these briefings, what was the point of setting guidelines for hearings? Additionally, this should be conducted in Washington. More and more workers are showing up to do their jobs across the country. We've proven that Congress can safely hold hearings and meet on the floor. Why can't we show up and work like so many other Americans? In any case, I think it's important discussion that we're having. Americans' constitutional right to peacefully protest is one of the things that makes this country so great. I'm committed to working with the majority of this committee to protect constitutional rights. Peaceful protests should be safe from harm, but it's important to note that many of the protests we've seen have been lately have been anything but peaceful. There have been radical anarchist groups that have brought rioting, tearing down public statues, and looting of private property. And the very businesses that we protect and work so hard to protect, in many cases the provisions of the CARES Act, are being harmed. I'm not sure what other choice an officer has than to continue to do their job. In Seattle, we've seen anti-police zones, and in so many communities across the country, calls to defund police and further violence. For the radical left, their vision of the future is mobs and not jobs. Mr. Ngo, Attorney General Barr has stated that some of the rioting and violence we've been seeing lately was because extremist groups hijacked some of these protests. Can you speak to some of the instances and shed some light on what has been happening with anarchist groups inciting violence?
I'm here on the ground. I would like to bring your attention to this manual that I received from that so-called autonomous zone in Seattle. When I was there, there was a lot of radical anarchist Antifa literature that was being disseminated like candy, booklets and manuals. This one in particular provides instructions on how to use crowds, quote, crowds of ordinary everyday people is our first line of defense against a police attack. Draw a crowd by calling a meeting of some kind to discuss the crisis or just to dance. If the police build barricades, the crowd will be between us and the cops. So there are very specific instructions, training going around about exploiting large numbers of people as human shields. And that's what we saw, that's what we see happening every day in Portland. So, for example, last week when they barricaded the North Police Precinct and set it on fire, you know what people in the crowd were shouting at the same time that they were doing this? Peaceful protest. So there's a lot of misinformation and propaganda going out there, particularly from, in my view, biased journalists and many media crews on the ground in these situations because it's so dangerous. So it's important to recognize that, yes, the majority of the people taking to the streets across the country are peaceful, but it only takes a very small amount of people to turn a demonstration into a riot and cause millions and millions of dollars in damages, as we've seen, destroying livelihoods and causing the deaths of people as well. Let's not forget that.
Yeah. Causing hurt. I could see it, and if I understand what you're saying is that these instructions that are being putting out by these these groups like Antifa, when they hijack this crowd that's doing a peaceful, they sort of drown out the message. But then also by doing that, the police are trying to keep everybody safe, and there's being some harm done to people that should not be happening in your case, by the groups, and in some other cases, by the police trying to keep people safe?
Yes, I think police are in an impossible situation. So in Portland, for example, they retreated. And you know what happened on our first night of rioting? For 5 hours, mobs of people had full control of downtown, looted the mall, started fires all over. So there was pressure for police to respond. So the next day they used tear gas and others to disperse violent rioters. And then that was framed as police brutality, and the city council then restricted some of their tools to be able to effectively control the crowd. And the same thing has happened in Seattle with the injunction there. So I don't know what politicians want police to do. Do you want them to protect life and protect property? Or do you want to give rioters the ability to destroy and kill as they've done?
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. I now recognize Representative Mary Gay Scanlon for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to join you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great. I'm a reporter. 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 6 times Samantha Melamed repeated that phrase as she was arrested while covering Philadelphia protests last week in response to police violence. You know, the ability of a free press to report on and speak truth to power is a foundational and critical piece of our American democracy. It's a value that even predates the Constitution. It can be traced back to the trial of John Peter Zenger in New York in 1735. Zenger was a printer who published a series of newspaper articles exposing the corruption of the English governor at that time. He was defended, and the right to a free press was established by one of my predecessors, the quintessential Philadelphia lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, not to be confused with Alexander Hamilton. But since that time, our country, our countrymen, our countrywomen, and our Constitution have recognized
Thank you, Chairman
the importance of
Ross.
a free press to be able to expose corruption and speak truth to power. In the past few weeks, we have seen an unprecedented number of arrests of journalists and attacks on journalists. There's even a website that chronicles this, the United States Press Freedom Tracker. This used to be something we looked at other countries in shock and horror to see. Attacks upon the press, assaults upon the press. But unfortunately, we've seen growing numbers of attacks and arrests of the press in our country over the past 3 years. I want to thank the chair for bringing together this hearing because it's so important right now. I do want to mention that I've joined Chairman Adam Schiff in introducing House Resolution 999 to condemn the recent violence and arrests against reporters on the front lines of covering protests, and to reaffirm Congress's commitment to protecting the free press, which is how we all get information so that we know what's going on in our country. I hope my colleagues on this committee will join us in this important resolution. I did want to talk to our 2 reporters here. Mr. Gustavo Martinez, I'm sorry. You said something that really resonated about the silencing of journalists by law enforcement is a fundamental threat to our democracy. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. Well, as many of you have put well before me, it's the First Amendment in our Constitution, and it enables not just journalists but people in general, the citizenry, to go out and document and report on what happens around them, and that's a great power and liberty that we have enshrined in our Constitution. So it's alarming to see that different actors are out there trying to silence what we do as journalists and also what people are doing by documenting misconduct and other problems that are happening in their communities.
And I note that both you and Ms. Tirado have reported the assaults and the arrests that you experienced to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. But the Philadelphia Inquirer reporter whose arrest I just noted does not appear there. There are over 141 incidents that have been reported just since the start of this year, and most of them occurring in the past month. So we know that there's underreporting. Ms. Tirado, you, I don't know if Ms. Tirado is still with us, but if she is, you talked about the fact that the U.S. is becoming more dangerous to be a journalist. Can you expand upon that?
Yes, and thank you, Congresswoman. As I said in my opening statement, I have been covering protests and civil unrest since 2014. And at no point did I have a reasonable expectation that I would go and be shot in the face in the course of doing my job. As you noted, we're seeing those incidents of violence against the press, arrests, attacks ticking up substantially in the past few weeks compared to what we'd seen in previous years. And that worries me, both as a citizen and as a journalist.
Thank you. Yes, I was involved in an investigation for NPR back before I came to Congress that had to do with the first deaths in the line of duty of NPR journalists that took place back in 2016.
The gentlelady's time has expired, so please get right to your question if you've got it.
Okay,
Or
I'm
if you
sorry.
want a closing point.
I do have very, very strong concern about the escalation of violence against journalists in the United States, and I view it as a fundamental threat to our democracy. So thank you so much for having this hearing.
And thank you very much, Ms. Scanlon. We will do one second round of questions, and so I will recognize myself first for 5 minutes. And Dean Brown-Nagin, let me start with you. There has been a lot of reporting about these extremist elements trying to exploit the nonviolent movement by Black Lives Matter and the vast majority of protesters for the purposes of inciting a race war. We know that several members of Boogaloo have been arrested for the murder of Officer Underwood. We know that Proud Boys, the Ku Klux Klan, other white supremacist groups are there. I had not heard about Antifa. I just pulled an article June 9th by Ryan Lucas saying no sign of Antifa so far. A Justice Department case is brought over unrest, and it looked at 51 cases brought by the Department of Justice. There's no one associated with Antifa who's been charged, but let's assume one were to get involved. We know that there's extremist right-wing white supremacist activity, and for some reason there's this obsessive focus on Antifa, and I hope that's not just some kind of political ploy. But in any event, my question is, when these extremists get into a crowd to try to incite by throwing a bottle or something, if Boogaloo and the Proud Boys and the Ku Klux Klan throw a bottle or start saying, kill the police or whatever, how does that change the dynamics of the protest? I've read about some cases where protesters try to isolate them and say, stop what you're doing. This is not. How does it change the dynamics of the protest? And then what should the police response be if you've got a Boogaloo guy who shows up with a gun or who tries to exploit the situation to create violence?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I would say that we ought to be able to, and police officers ought to be able to distinguish between peaceful protesters and those who come into the protest to exploit it and to try to overtake it in ways that undermine the peaceful demonstration. Police officers are within their right, obviously, to try to isolate those elements and move them out. The point that I would make is that the presence of those elements, those violent elements, cannot undermine the rights of those who are peacefully demonstrating.
What a great point. I mean, in a way, it's analogous to Derek Chauvin, the police officer who murdered Officer Floyd. We don't blame all officers for what that officer did. He's the one who's being prosecuted for second-degree murder. He was the one who did that, and we don't believe in collective guilt and mass punishment under our system of due process. So if you've got one Boogaloo guy who shows up to try to create trouble and throws a bottle, you don't start shooting journalists and other people because of that. So I very much appreciate that point. Speaking of which, Mr. Martinez, so you've been a journalist for a long time in Asbury Park, which of course was the home of Bruce Springsteen for a long time. Did you do anything to provoke violence against you or to provoke your arrest by the police? I mean, what was it you were doing when you were apprehended and arrested?
Chairman, thank you for the question. What I was doing was following police orders. They were ordering us to leave the area, so I was leaving as I started hearing screams coming from behind me and turned to record what was happening. But I always follow police orders. I never confronted or taunted any police officer.
Gotcha. If Ms. Ratliff, let me come back to you. You probably had some time to reflect about your great aunt's career as a civil rights hero. She was one of the people who tried to desegregate the Democratic National Convention, or as my colleagues across I would say, the Democrat Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. We're not ashamed that the civil rights movement came to the Democratic Party. We're proud that we are a political party that transformed itself and left white supremacy and violent racism behind. But I wonder what your reflections are about what your aunt went through and then what you're going through today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I think it's powerful testimony to the resilience of the Black community, to resilience of the leaders in the Black community that are continuing to be on the front line of these issues. I think seeing that, hearing about her stories, reading about her stories in the past few weeks, and even learning more about her than I did as growing up as a child, I think it's important to focus on how powerful and amazing she was. How even after she suffered brutalization at the hands of officers before she went to prison and even when she was arrested, even after she was arrested, it speaks to the fact that this issue was beyond her, the same way this issue is beyond me. And that the purpose of what we're doing, although we've encountered brutality, although we've encountered opposition to what we're doing, that it's not going to stop us, that this isn't something that is going to prevent us from continuing to use our voice and continuing to push until the needed reforms and changes take place in this country. And systemic racism is no longer a big issue.
Thank you very much. My time is up, but for anyone who's interested, the episode 5 of Eyes on the Prize has a wonderful profile of Fannie Lou Hamer and what took place in 1964. So I recommend it to anyone interested in the life of Ms. Ratliff's great aunt. And I'm now happy to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of additional questioning. If Mr. Jordan is there. Mr. Jordan, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Mr.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dean Brown-Nagin, in your opening statement, you said some police have violated Americans' First Amendment liberties. Have some governors violated Americans' First Amendment liberties as well during this lockdown?
I'm not quite sure what you mean. I did hear you talk about the lockdown orders and the way in which there's been differential treatment of those protesters versus the peaceful protesters against racial injustice. That has not been my observation. My sense has been that the police officers have been incredibly restrained in the context of the lockdown protest. As to governors, my understanding is that cases have been filed against the orders of some governors, and that is the right.
Let me ask you this. A month and a half ago, actually 2 months ago, the Attorney General issued a memorandum to U.S. attorneys telling them to be concerned and looking for potential violations of people's First Amendment rights, religious liberty rights, and others. And in that, he said the Constitution is not suspended in times of crisis. Do you agree with that statement?
Of course, we ought to be able to both take care of our citizens during a pandemic and respect everyone's constitutional rights.
Okay, then let me give you an example here. The Virginia governor has an order that you can't meet in groups of larger than 10. 16 people met in a sanctuary that could accommodate 225 people. Do you believe that is a violation of the those American citizens' First Amendment religious liberty rights?
Well, certainly those individuals are able to take that case to court if they want to make that. Governors, of course, have police powers that are designed to further public safety, and I believe that was the motivation behind that order.
Yeah. What about the double standard? What about this same governor, Governor Northam, who is doing a press briefing in a much smaller room where there are 21 people in the room? Is there some kind of concern you would have there when you have a governor saying you can't assemble and exercise your religious liberty rights, even though it's 16 people in a sanctuary that accommodates 225 people, and yet he can do a press conference in a much smaller room where there are 21 people? Does that concern you? Someone who lectures and instructs students on the First Amendment and on their fundamental liberties?
Right. Well, I don't know very much about the facts that you discussed. I would want to know who those people are. Were they journalists? Were they officers of the law? Were they following the mandate?
That raises an interesting situation, because I know in Louisville, Kentucky, the governor had done the same thing. You couldn't have church services, even drive-in church services. And he was actually citing people who had a drive-in in their car, not going into a sanctuary. He prohibited even that. But I wonder, we never hear of anything where the press was there filming it. Of course, only the parishioners coming for a drive-in service were cited. The press wasn't cited. So some First Amendment liberties were allowed to be exercised, but others weren't. Here's what the governor of New Jersey said. When asked about all this and whether his lockdown order comported with the Constitution, he said, quote, "I wasn't thinking of the Bill of Rights when we did this." Does that give you much, does that concern you when you got a governor of a major state saying he's not really focused on the Bill of Rights when he issues these lockdown orders? Dean?
Well, I would like to think that the Bill of Rights is always present in our minds. And as I said, people are entitled to challenge those orders if they would like, and they think
They are. They're challenging Mayor Garcetti on his Second Amendment, his prohibition on gun stores being open. They're challenging Governor Newsom on his lockdown on not being able to go to church. They're definitely doing that. Americans certainly understand. Are you concerned about the double standard? The idea that a mayor can walk out without a mask, since Mr. Raskin is so concerned about that, without a mask, a mayor in Los Angeles can walk out while the protesters are chanting defund the police, kneel down without a mask around all kinds of people, but at the same time, he puts sand at the skate park so kids can't skate outside in the skate park. You concerned about the double standard that you see out there?
Well, I'm not sure that I've seen the same double standard that you are articulating. As I said, I have noticed at the protests, as others have, that many people are wearing masks, and so they're trying to reconcile
Governor Northam takes a selfie at a protest when he won't let 16 people go to church in a sanctuary that holds 225 people. And I'm asking if the double standard is helpful to First Amendment liberties and protecting them, or harmful.
Well, I believe the governor apologized for not wearing a mask.
So he can apologize, but he still kept the standard on everyone else. So this is what drives so many Americans crazy, is the double standard they see out there. Mr. Chairman, I understand my time is out, so I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, for your questioning. And Ms. Presley, you're up again for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just picking up on my last line, again, in the earlier days of the civil rights movement, when the people spoke up and demanded justice, President Johnson used federal forces to protect Black Americans. Today, Donald Trump, in a move that surprises no one, is using federal forces to attack Black Americans. Dean Nagin, has any other president of the United States responded to peaceful protesters in this way?
Well, I would say not to my knowledge. It is important to appreciate that President Kennedy and President Johnson and others understood the power of peaceful protest in our society. And as you mentioned, the protests at Birmingham and the protests at Selma gave rise to the legislation that is made us substantially freer in this country today in terms of race.
Yes. How does this response compare to the anti-lockdown demonstrations we have seen in dozens of states across the nation to protest life-saving protective measures against the coronavirus? What comparisons would you draw?
Sure. I would say that in the context of the lockdown protests, I've noticed that police officers have been incredibly restrained. I have not noticed any violence against protesters, batons or bullets or tear gas. By contrast, in the context of the protest following the death of George Floyd, we have seen a lot of that. And so there has been a remarkable difference in terms of the response.
Thank you, Dean. And I would just say that, you know, the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Diane Nagins and the John Lewises and the Dr. Kings, you know, we elevate them now as luminaries of the movement, but I'm quite certain that they were vilified and falsely and hurtly mischaracterized then in the same way that the protesters and demonstrators on the front lines of this movement are being today. Those who do not learn from their history are condemned to repeat it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon, if you're still out there, you have 5 minutes more to question.
Thank you so much. It's a favorite issue for me, so I appreciate the opportunity to participate. Dean Brown-Nagin, I just wanted to go back to you for a minute. Can you speak as a constitutional scholar a little bit to the importance of the exercise of a free press in our country and what that means as a pillar of our democracy?
Sure. Thank you for that question. The respect for the press as a part of the bundle of rights that are protected under the First Amendment, and it's absolutely vital to a free society. The press, members of the press, are in a position to tell us, to report on the facts on the ground, to expose government wrongdoing, and therefore it's so important for us to respect the role of the press in a free society. They're the eyes and ears of the American people.
Thank you. Ms. Tirado, I wanted to return to you for a minute. You've described in rather harrowing detail what happened to you, but let me just get into some of the details. How would police on the scene know that you or anyone else is a journalist?
Yeah, so I was wearing my credentials and a lanyard around my neck. I had a professional grade camera and a full flash. I also wasn't right in with the protesters. I was in between protesters and police, and I was clearly taking pictures and acting in my capacity as press.
You've covered other presses or protests before, including in Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed, correct?
Yes.
And that was 2015, 16?
2014.
2014. Okay. Can you compare your experience in Ferguson to what happened in Minneapolis?
Compare as to what?
Just in terms of interactions with the police. I assume that you were not shot at in Ferguson.
Yes, I was not blinded in Ferguson, certainly. Unfortunately, I was in Minneapolis on Thursday and Friday, whereas I was embedded in Ferguson for quite a long time. So what I can say is that it is very common, and it was common in Ferguson, to speak to the police and identify yourself as press. I carried on that same practice in Minneapolis to the extent that I could. But overall, I would say that even in Ferguson, in the midst of that situation, I had no expectation that I would be shot at point blank in the face during a lull when it was reasonably quiet. And as we learned, I did not have that expectation. I did not walk away from Minneapolis with that same sense of security.
Of course not. You also covered the Bundy standoff in 2014, where armed cattle ranchers who happened not to be Black seized federal land Can you describe how the police responded to that incident compared with what you've witnessed in response to the Black Lives Matter protests?
Sure. And to clarify, that was in January of 2016.
Okay.
So there was main differences is that that was a very tiny rural area versus urban situation. So that's going to change a lot of it. But we rarely saw a federal or a local police presence down on the refuge itself. With the exception of occasionally the sheriffs would come and there would be a bit of a summit at the top of that hill. Largely, the FBI confined itself to being in town and in surrounding areas. So that had been my experience out in Oregon.
And that was a situation where cattle ranchers actually occupied and took over a federal installation for a period of time. Is that right?
Yes, with the help of supplemental militias from 3 surrounding states.
Okay. Just looking back, how is your experience as a freelance journalist different than journalists who work for larger networks?
So largely that's a question of workplace protection. So for example, if I worked for a masthead, I would have an editorial staff, attached lawyers for legal fees. I would have, presumably some insurance or workers' comp. Since I'm self-employed and I do work for various outlets, since this has happened to me, I'm responsible for all of the bills, any legal claims that I might have. Were I to get arrested, I would be responsible for bailing myself out. And as we saw in Ferguson, when Ryan Riley and Wesley Lowery were arrested, their mastheads came in and helped them bail themselves out and things of that nature. So freelancers really do have to look out for themselves on a level that's different than staff positions would.
I see that my time has expired, but thank you for your journalism and your photography skills and for being here today.
Okay, thank you very much. So before we close, and I'm going to come to Mr. Jordan for any closing thoughts he has, but are there any other briefers who would like to take a minute to close? Ms. Tirado, I don't know if that encapsulates it for you or whether there was anything else you wanted to say.
I thank the committee for taking the time for this issue, and I really hope that all of our collective witness has been helpful.
Very much so. Thank you. Dean Brown-Nagin, do you have a closing thought for us?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I thank the House of Representatives for taking steps to affirm the rights under the First Amendment of the American people and journalists.
Thank you. Mr. Ngo, would you leave us with a parting thought?
Thank you so much to this committee, as well as my co-panelists. I hope those who have been injured get the justice that they deserve.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Ratliff, do you have a closing thought?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for holding this very important. And thank you to all the panelists that have shared your stories. Thank you for being an inspiration to people around the country as we continue to advocate and we continue to use our First Amendment rights.
I appreciate that. Mr. Martinez.
Subcommittee for hosting me today. And I just would like to remind everybody that the Constitution and the First Amendment protects everybody, not just journalists. As we've seen today, as we're hearing from everybody here, everybody is protected under the law, and that should be respected.
Thank you very much. And finally, Reverend Gerbasi.
Thank you. So my faith calls me to respect the dignity of every human being. And part of what is antithetical to my faith is the conflating of peaceful protesters with violent criminals. Violence is never the answer. And I witnessed the government's use of violence against peaceful people, which violates the tenets of my faith and the faith of most peaceful people. And I ache for that. And I yearn for racial justice in this country.
Thank you for your witness and your testimony. And before I give a closing thought, I'm going to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan, you're still there? Okay, well, let me just close. I want to, first of all, Reverend Gerbasi, you're my constituent, so I'm especially proud of the role that you've played in this, but I'm really proud of every single person here for standing up for the First Amendment, for the Constitution, and the freedoms that are the lifeblood of our democracy. I find it terribly searing that there are two people who appeared with us today who were injured in their eyes. And Ms. Tirado, I am very sorry you've lost vision in one of your eyes, but this is the year 2020, and you still very much have perfect vision in terms of understanding what's going on in America, and we need you still on the front lines of journalism. Ms. Ratliff, our thoughts and our hopes are with you that you make a complete recovery from the injuries you suffered, and for everybody here who has suffered different kinds of wounds and injuries at the hands of government violence or other kinds of violence. Our thoughts are with you. It's a tough time for America, and we're in the throes of trying to repair a broken social contract, a social contract that's been broken for centuries because of violent white supremacy and racism. And, you know, the Supreme Court said in the Dred Scott decision in the 19th century that the African American has no rights that the white man is bound to respect, and that the Constitution is a white man's compact. And we tried to overthrow that understanding in the Civil War with the Reconstruction Amendments. And Reconstruction lasted for 12 years of meaningful, strong interracial progress in democracy before it was undone again by violent white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan and the Night Riders and the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the grandfather clauses and so on. And then it would be almost another century before the modern civil rights movement brought us a second Reconstruction through the nonviolent blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner Cheney Goodman and Medgar Evers and Viola Luisa and everybody who put their lives on the line to build the dream of America is a place of justice and equal rights and opportunity for all. And we have slid back towards the baseline of violent white supremacy in far too many ways. But Black Lives Matter and the wonderful young people who've been out at the barricades in large cities and small towns across America have given us hope for a new lease on life and for a reformation of our social contract so that it is meaningfully inclusive of everyone, so that we really can fight for democracy and justice and freedom and civil rights and civil liberties for everybody. So I want to thank again all of our briefers for participating. You have done your country a great service today, and I want to thank all of the members who attended and participated as well. With that, the meeting is adjourned.